This episode of Off the Shelf is brought to us by Busy Bee Vegan Skincare. Busy Bee is an all-natural skincare line dedicated to healthy, vegan, plant-based skincare and overall wellness. They offer a selection of handcrafted body scrubs, butters, and washes that not only make your skin glow but smell amazing. Their unique all-natural scents include gingerbread, ruby grapefruit, caramel cake, and morning latte. So why not treat your skin to something fresh and all-natural? Head on over to shopbusybeevegan.com today. And as a special bonus, Busy Bee is offering listeners of this podcast a 15% discount on your first order with the code OrdinaryPodcasts. Thanks for listening and enjoy this week's episode of Off the Shelf. Hello everybody, welcome back to Off the Shelf, the podcast where we take books off of our shelves and into our hearts. My name is Julia and I'm here today to check in with you on our book of the month for August, Brian Selznick's Kaleidoscope, with a short exposition on Selznick himself, the context for when and where and why he wrote the book, as well as jumping into a discussion on what I think of as one of the book's most unique aspects, its illustrations. Before I get started, I wanted to reassure you that I'll be trying my best to avoid major spoilers today in case you haven't gotten the chance to pick up the book yet, or if you aren't as far as you'd like to be in working your way through. If you have picked up the book, I also wanted to reassure you that if you're confused or feel like you haven't quite gotten it yet, you probably aren't alone. That's what we're here for today, and for this whole month, to try to crack the code on why this book feels like it has a lot to say, but it doesn't want to give it to us so easily. For starters, Brian Selznick is an award-winning American author, illustrator, maybe best known for his 2007 breakout work, The Invention of Hugo Cabret. In an interview with Reading Rockets, he shares the way that he remembers drawing and making things from a very young age. Unsurprising, judging by the quality and the skill and obvious mastery of his work. Initially, however, creating books was never something he'd dreamed of pursuing, or even maybe really wanted to pursue. His father, an accountant, had always appreciated and supported Brian's art, but he worried about his son's prospects for making a life for himself as an artist. And even though Selznick didn't let this stop him from attending an art school, he did for a long time try to distance himself from making his art a career. Maybe partly also for the fear of turning something he loved into an obligation, a responsibility. I think to an extent many of us can understand that fear. When our hobbies or even our passions become our livelihoods, we feel the ups and downs of our lives through those passions, and sometimes the stress and pressure that creates makes those things more of a chore than anything else. Finding a work-play balance in this is really important in these cases because work will stay work. But we risk also making our play into work, and as anyone who's experienced burnout can attest to, our brains want and need more than just work. Becoming an author actually came about as a result of Selznick's not getting into the graduate school he'd wanted to attend in the theater set design department of his fancy Rhode Island art school. He decided instead to take some time for himself, to travel and to figure out how in his life he could make something beautiful out of what seemed like little more than disappointment and failure. During his travels, he wrote and drew and let his creativity flow until he finally came to the conclusion that maybe all along, the career path he'd intentionally avoided for so long was something he was actually meant to do. Since then, he's made quite a name for himself in doing so, in becoming a storyteller. He still works mainly within the realm of children's literature, having gotten his start while working at a children's bookstore with little to no knowledge of the genre, apart from, as he admits, Green Eggs and Ham and Where the Wild Things Are. He published his first book while working at the store in 1991, and his career blossomed from there, working on illustrations for other authors before taking on the project of his very own first novel-length work, the project that would eventually become Hugo Cabret. I wanted to highlight the fact that Selznick has jumped career goals and paths, and that he's met and worked through disappointment, because I think it's really quite important for everyone, but especially for young people, to realize and remember that It's okay to try things and have them not work out. It's okay to change your mind about what you think you're meant to do in your life. It's okay to get into something and then realize, hey, this isn't actually for me. And to think about what matters to you and to think about the things you do because they speak to who you wish you could be. Or maybe think about the things you do simply because you can't imagine your life without doing those things. I go back to this quote all the time because I was one of those kids who read The Outsiders in grade 8 and felt like my whole life was different after, but I quote, "You still have a lot of time to make yourself be what you want." Unquote. Be patient and kind with yourself. Life feels like it goes really fast, but we have so much time. In the author's note that follows the story of Kaleidoscope, Selznick mentions that he wrote and drew the majority of the book while in lockdown, as per pandemic restrictions, stuck across the country from his husband. He'd previously been working on and off on a different book, but nothing about it was seeming to work for him anymore. Somehow, out of the desperation and frustration and anxiety of lockdown came something beautiful. The images and stories that would eventually find their final shape as a part of this novel. Particular and very distinct images and themes, as he notes, unite the scattered and shattered pieces that make up the book. And they never look the same twice. A bit different to every person who looks at them, and even from one person's first viewing to their second or their third. The book is a study in the abstract, and it's beautiful. And it still surprises me that it, like Selznick's other major works, is tagged as children's literature. Is it because of its association with his other works? Because the main characters are children? Because of its illustrations? Or because of the fantastic, the magical realism, the imaginativism? I don't know. But I bought it at my workplace, a children's bookstore, partly because nobody else was buying it, and partly because I'm familiar with Selznick and got curious about it. Honestly, though, it's not the first book I'd suggest to kids in the store looking for something new. It reads more like something I would have read and honestly probably not understood on a quick first read, even at the university level. This book is beautiful to me in so many ways, but it's something that I really feel like I have to dig into to really feel like I understand. And that's something I've been trained to do, but not everybody is. It's something that I'm not even always very good at, even being trained to do it. More often than not, I feel like I'm missing something. And I think that turns people off a lot. But I'm here to tell you that there is so much joy and so much pride in digging into a book and really feeling like you understand it and talking to other people who also have deep thoughts about it. And that's what we're here to do. So I'm really excited to think about this book with you, and maybe even to get you a little bit hooked on digging into books, on dissecting them, on, I don't know, maybe overanalyzing them sometimes. I remember having these moments of epiphany in classes sometimes where we would be talking about a book I did not get and did not feel anything for. And I'd have this moment where something fell into place and it all made sense. And that was one of the best feelings. There's so much there. So much waiting for us to find it. And if I can recreate that feeling of epiphany for you, then I've done my job, I think. I wasn't really aware of it before taking a couple of classes on children's literature, but there is a science, a psychology to the art of book illustration. There are a lot of different ways to do book illustration, and even if it doesn't seem like it, every line, every brush stroke, every color is intentional and purposeful. Selznick is no stranger to this fact. So I guess the next question is, if illustrations can be so ripe with meaning, if what they may add to a story is so invaluable to its telling, then why don't we see more illustrated novels for an adult or general audience? Part of the answer is practical, and a simple one. It's because printing novel-length books with illustrations is expensive, and because while many children rely on illustrations for understanding and comprehension, that's something that we eventually outgrow. The other reason goes back to us, to our attitudes and our biases and our assumptions about what quality mature literature is. Say if Kaleidoscope is considered children's lit because of its illustrations alone, then why is that so? Does it have to be? What does that tag, that category, say about it to us at a quick first glance? We so often associate illustrations as juvenile and simple, but there's no real reason why this has to be the case. Just because we outgrow the need for illustrations for comprehension as our experiences and our vocabularies grow, I don't think that should have to mean that the value they once had to us and to the stories they helped tell completely goes away. Whether a book's illustrations reflect just what the words say, or they tell a story all on their own, they bring so much to a story that wouldn't otherwise be there, or at least that would be much more difficult to achieve without them. If part of the outcome of reading or indulging in other art forms as adults is understanding and seeing the person behind their creation, then illustrations in books can only serve to give us a better rounded, more clear and truthful interpretation, and maybe most significantly of all, beyond the realms of children's lit, as themes and plots and conflicts gain complexity and become more dynamic. Seeing the story at the same time as we read it takes some of the pressure off of our imaginations and allows us to make more deep and meaningful and emotional connections to the characters, their relationships, and their experiences. But anyway, I don't actually want to harp too much on whether or not this is really a book meant for children. At least not yet. I've already talked out why I think specific age demographics stuck onto books like this one are pretty meaningless, and anyway, I'd rather turn to my focus for the rest of today's talk. One of my favorite aspects of this book and Selznick's other works, that being the artwork interspersed with his writing. Brian Selznick isn't the only novelist to work with illustrations, of course, even illustrations as beautiful and detailed and telling as the ones in Kaleidoscope. But in my reading, he is something of a master in telling many different stories at once through the interaction between his art and his words. In the same interview I mentioned previously, he talks about the way that Hugo Cabret hovers somewhere between the graphic novel and the picture book. His illustrations seem to, at times, quite coherently tell another story, or even many other interpretations, parallel to the one that he writes, purely because they don't use language to define or rule what our interpretations should be. Kaleidoscope is written in a very similar vein, I think. That is, the book's illustrations give us a small piece of the story Selznick is about to tell, and without saying anything at all, they inspire our speculation on what's to come. In stories as abstract as the ones included in Kaleidoscope, I think that in some ways the interpretations we come up with and the conclusions we draw from the illustrations alone tell their own story. And they sometimes may come up just as valuable and as valid as the actual stories as Selznick tells them through his writing. As the book's given summary suggests, because the fragmented stories that make up the book and the snapshots of life that come with them don't really give us the whole picture, we have to fill in the blanks ourselves, meaning that they look and mean a bit different to each of us, to each of our individual interpretations. It takes a lot of skill, I think, to do that well, because there's always the danger in writing a story that can mean many different things that you'll fall short of capturing its core, where all of those varied and different interpretations come together. Different readings and opinions between audience members is pretty much inevitable, but where there's no consensus or unitedness, there's little to discuss or even to debate. The threads that string together the stories in Kaleidoscope aren't tightly woven by any means, but they are absolutely, undoubtedly there, and each reader is then given the opportunity to decide, at least for themselves and their own understanding, how exactly those pieces all fit together in the end. In his work on Kaleidoscope, Selznick is both author and illustrator, which is less common than in cases where the collaboration between word and image also involves a dynamic partnership between writer and artist. The two may be similar but rarely identical meanings they intend to convey. However, just because Selznick is both author and illustrator doesn't necessarily mean that there can be only one united way each of the stories in the novel, or the novel as a whole, can be interpreted. To be honest, I get the feeling that Being the sole voice on meaning is something he specifically avoids. The most concrete way he shows this in Kaleidoscope is through the images themselves. Each story is accompanied by two illustrations, one being the full image and the other sectioning off a small portion of it and reflecting it as if through a kaleidoscope. Not broken exactly, but fragmented. Just as different readers will hone in on different aspects and elements of the stories themselves, we each might look at those images just a little bit differently and think differently about what they each look like. The stories in Kaleidoscope are similarly abstract. They are vignettes, snapshots of life, sometimes little more than a handful of paragraphs and a few brief conversations between two characters. Within them, a lot more remains unsaid than what's told. All this to say, there is a depth to this particular book's illustrations that enhances the words they accompany, and highlight particular elements of the stories in new and different and unique ways that we might not otherwise recognize in the words alone. Each level of the narrative, the words, the image, and the kaleidoscopic image, lead us further into the story itself and closer into maybe what we're meant to take away from it in the end. It doesn't spell it out for us, but it does give us a pretty clear idea of what's important, what matters. What's maybe most interesting about those 3 steps is that we take them in reverse. What comes first is the kaleidoscopic image, then we take a step out to the regular image, and then we take a further step out to the story. It isn't until we finish the story, and sometimes even after, that we realize what we were really looking at in the first place. We enter the story already with an idea of where it's leading and what we should be focusing on, what the author wants us to focus on. It isn't necessarily the only thing the story has to say, but it does lead us a little bit closer to discovering what is drawing these stories all together. By beginning at the core of the story, we're able to focus on and pick up on the pieces of the narrative of the written word that we might miss otherwise. Maybe my favorite aspect of the book's illustrations is the way that we're given both the whole picture and the fragmented one. The cover of the book depicts an iris and pupil of an eye, giving us a type of center or core to hone in on. And each of the kaleidoscopic images do this as well. It invites us into what is unknown, what is up to interpretation, and it encourages us to step inside in spite of the fact that we don't know what we'll find inside or on the next page. And I think to some extent it reflects life in that way. We don't always know from the outset where the path we're being led down is going to bring us, what dangers or what fears or uncertainties might wait for us there. What the full images and the stories to follow show us is that so often on the other side of uncertainty is not only knowledge but beauty and a lot of hope and love. And even though sometimes those things come with pain too, there is so much that we lose out on if we stick with our fear and if we never take that chance at all. I know I've already said just maybe a few times that Selznick's illustrations are one of my favorite parts of his books. And I don't think that really needs much explanation or justification. There are certain elements of the reading experience that illustrations bring that the written word can't, or at least that it usually falls short of achieving. Illustrations inspire a greater and deeper level of emotional connection through expressions and through the use of color. All of this is why I kind of resent the idea that picture books or graphic novels are juvenile or not worth our time or less worth our time only because they have illustrations. I think there's still this held onto myth that a story that can't get its meaning across through its words has to rely on pictures. But pictures aren't only there to supplement somebody's lack of eloquence. They are a form of storytelling, just like the written word. They aren't secondary, they are equal. Because writing is just another form of art. It's another form of our self-expression. The written word shouldn't come out above those other forms of art, music, painting, drawing, just because it has the power of speech, of definition, of logic or reason, or whatever it is we have decided is the most important. In my opinion, there should be no story that is too advanced and too mature to be able to be depicted and shown through art. These things create bridges where words can otherwise draw lines. They welcome differing interpretations and viewpoints where words tend to more often rule out what's right or wrong, allowed or not allowed, open or restricted. There are no language barriers in images. Stories, by their nature, often try to give us everything they can, and they're constantly moving forward, so that means there's always more to tell. Illustration is frozen in time. It can offer us only a small piece of the whole picture, one perspective, but the good thing about it is that that perspective is undoubtedly intentional. Illustration encourages our attention and our focus to that small piece, and in the process, I think what they imply is that we might best understand by taking a story piece by piece rather than by taking on the overwhelming whole all at once. As I think we see through Kaleidoscope, when illustration is there to take some of the burden of the telling off of the words, the story can afford to be more simple, more abstract and interpretive, and maybe more of a study in feeling rather than just an exposition of the specific goings-on. Through these elements, Selznick welcomes the diversity of our interpretations and our perspectives, and as a reader, that's something I value a lot. The thought that an author maybe intentionally opens up the stories and their meanings to us, so that it can be exactly for us what we need it to be in this particular moment of our reading. I am saying all of this as reassurance. Something I learned very quickly studying English is that there's really never only one answer. Literature isn't like science or math. It's interpretive and it's opinionated. And as long as you can justify and validate the interpretation from the text itself, then it isn't wrong. Kaleidoscope is a confusing book. I'm on my second read through. Don't be discouraged about it if you feel like you aren't getting it right away, or if you're even a little bit lost. Take your time with it, reread it, absorb the words and the images, and observe. Don't just read what they wish you to understand. There is a lot there that underlies the text and saturates the images, but it isn't easy to pull out. And maybe part of the beauty of the book's mystery is that it stays a mystery. Maybe we don't have to understand everything. In life, we don't understand everything, especially when it comes to love and to grief and loss. I sometimes feel like the biggest mystery in our lives isn't anything outside of ourselves, but our own minds and hearts and our consciousness. As I said before, give yourself time and give the book time. Let yourself be and let the book be. And take life and take the book as it is, as it comes to you. I really, really hope that this helps your reading. And for today, I'll leave you here. Take good care until next time, and happy reading. The Off the Shelf podcast is a proud member of the Ordinary Podcasting Network. To learn more about this podcast or the network, please visit ordinarypodcast.com. Finally, thank you for listening, and if you haven't already, please subscribe or leave us a comment. Thank you so much, and take care.